Fort Harrison was established in October 1811 by William Henry Harrison during the Tippecanoe campaign in Indiana Territory. It was built on high ground with a good view of the Wabash River and the surrounding prairie. After the Battle of Tippecanoe, the fort was left in the command of Josiah Snelling until May of 1812, when the United States declared war on Great Britain. Command of the fort was transferred to 27-year-old Zachary Taylor. The fort is sometimes called the Fort of Two Presidents, since it was established by the 9th President, Harrison, and later defended by Taylor, who would become the 12th President. Both men would have illustrious careers, though their presidencies are fairly obscure due to their very brief time in office. Both Harrison and Taylor died during their first term. The beginning of the War of 1812 was disastrous for the Americans. There was a pathetic attempt to invade Canada, followed by the loss of Mackinac, Detroit, and annihilation at Fort Dearborn. Settlers in the Northwest were in constant state of panic and flocked to wherever there was a fort or blockhouses. With British support, Tecumseh's coalition was ready to unleash a fury southward, all the way to the Ohio River, and kick out the settlers for good. Indian attacks increased throughout Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois territories, and as far west as the Mississippi. On September 3, 1812, a band of Miami Indians passing through the area in what is now Vigo County, Indiana, warned Captain Taylor that a force of roughly 600 warriors, made up of Shawnee, Potawatomi, Kickapoo, and other nations, were approaching the fort. The garrison was far from prepared to defend against such a force. An epidemic of summer sickness, as they called it, was spreading through the fort. Only about 15 out of 50 men were in valid fighting condition. On the same day, about 140 miles to the east, the small village of Pigeon Roost was attacked, which resulted in the deaths of 24 settlers and 4 natives. Close to sundown, gunshots were heard south of the fort. Taylor held off on sending a scouting party until the next morning. On September 4th, the bodies of 2 men, known as the Doyle brothers, were found shot, looted, and scalped. The scouts returned to report their findings. Captain Taylor, realizing the fort was likely surrounded, and every route controlled by natives, instructed his men to prepare for siege. Later that day, a party of around 40 natives, made up of both men and women, approached the fort under a flag of truce. The Kickapoo chief, Namatoha, asked to parley with the captain, which Taylor cautiously agreed to meet with him the next morning. The captain instructed his men to stay alert and issued 16 rounds to each soldier. Around 11 o'clock that night, Captain Taylor was awoken by a gunshot. When he went outside to investigate, he saw the southwest blockhouse up in flames. He ordered the men to their post and directed the buckets to be lowered into the well. The men were frightened, confused, and quite sluggish in executing the orders. By the time they got the buckets ready, the flames engulfed the stash of whiskey and destroyed the provisions stored in the blockhouse. The cattle around the fort would often chew and lick the log walls that made up the lower blockhouse, trying to get to the salt stored inside. This created holes in the walls, and the attacking warriors were able to stuff them with dry grass and set the structure on fire. The sight of the flames and the constant howling war cries of the besieging natives, mixed in with the crying women and children, were enough to shatter the spirits of the men. 2 of the soldiers jumped the walls and deserted, thinking they might have a better chance out in the wild. Captain Taylor kept his composure and shouted loud enough for both the defenders and the attackers to hear. "Taylor never surrenders," he yelled. This was enough to rally the men and get to work on controlling the fire and fortifying any gaps. The true heroes of the battle were the civilians taking refuge in the fort. Dr. William A. Clark, the fort surgeon, was instrumental in controlling the fire and led the effort in constructing a temporary breastwork to close the gap, all while under the constant fire from the attackers. During the course of filling up the buckets, the well got dangerously low. They started pulling up buckets of wet sand. A young woman by the name of Julia Lambert volunteered to be lowered into the well with a gourd so she could ensure the buckets would be full. She was a smaller woman, which made her the perfect candidate for fitting into a narrow hole in the ground. As she scraped the sand on the bottom, the water began to rise, and she was able to fill the buckets completely. Thanks to Julia's efforts, the defenders were able to keep the fire from spreading. The women and children molded bullets over the campfire, keeping up the supply of ammunition for the sentinels, providing cover fire for Dr. Clark and the others. One benefit of the burning blockhouse was that it illuminated the ramparts, making it easier for the riflemen to spot their enemy. Soldiers who were sick but capable of carrying a rifle were ordered to the rampart. They kept up the gunfire for hours, preventing the sieging warriors from breaching the stockade. One young soldier, named William Cohen, whom Captain Taylor described as a little deranged, climbed the bastion and fired down at the attacking natives. He turned back to his pals with a big grin on his face and said, "I got an Indian that time." But in his excitement, he forgot that he wasn't behind cover and was shot dead seconds later. An hour before dawn, one of the men who deserted earlier returned to the gate, begging for dear life to be let back in. Captain Taylor initially didn't respond, suspecting it could be some Indian trick. Dr. Clark, however, recognized the man's voice, told him to lay low behind an empty barrel. The other deserter, however, was found later, about 130 yards from the fort, dead and mutilated. By daylight, the natives had pulled back beyond rifle range, and the fighting was pretty much over. The warriors drove off the horses and shot the cattle. This pretty much eliminated the garrison's food supply. The only food left was a few bushels of corn. Everything else was destroyed in the fire. Captain Taylor made an attempt to send word of Vincennes on September 10th. 2 messengers were sent down the Wabash River at night, but had to turn back as the Potawatomi had camps on both sides of the river. Any other attempt would have to be done over land. Fortunately, word reached Vincennes from one of their own scouts who discovered the siege while traveling north. Colonel William Russell, who took over for General Harrison after he left to relieve Fort Wayne of its own siege, led an army of 1,200 men, consisting of the 7th U.S. Infantry, Indiana Militia, and Mounted Rangers, to Fort Harrison, and arrived on September 12th. Captain Taylor gave his report to Colonel Russell, who was surprised they lasted as long as they did. Though the fort was strengthened, the supply situation was still critical. A wagon, along with an escort of 13 men led by Lieutenant Fairbanks, was en route, about a day behind Russell's army, but they never made it. When they reached a point along the Wabash, known as the Narrows, they were ambushed by Potawatomi, and the men were killed and supplies plundered. Only 2 men survived the ambush: John Black, a civilian wagoneer, and Private Edward Perdue. Lieutenant Fairbanks' sword was recovered from the site years later, still stuck in the ground. A village nearby was named Fairbanks in his honor and remains there in present-day Sullivan County. Another wagon was sent soon after, commanded by Lieutenant Richardson, who was unaware of the fate of the previous wagon. As a result, they used the same route and fell into another ambush in the same spot. 7 men were killed, but the other half were able to get out with their scalps intact. The Potawatomi, satisfied with their plunder, cleared the area and dispersed into Illinois. The total losses on the American side were 23 killed and 5 wounded. This includes the Doyle brothers, defenders at the fort, and those attacked at the Narrows. Total losses among the native coalition are unknown. In the following months, Colonel William Russell and Major General Samuel Hopkins launched an expedition of retribution in both Illinois and Indiana territories, destroying many Indian towns in the process. Captain Taylor would continue to serve for the remainder of the war and receive a brevet rank of major. He would later serve in Blackhawks War and then in the Mexican-American War and earned the nickname Old Rough and Ready. Finally, he would end his career in the White House. The Battle of Fort Harrison is considered the first land victory for the United States in the War of 1812, though it's mostly overlooked and forgotten since it was a fairly small engagement. Even the battle memorial north of Terre Haute, Indiana, and the historical marker seems tucked away and forgotten. Today it stands near a golf course and what looks like somebody's backyard. Few stop to see the juxtaposition of a once brutal frontier and present-day industrial America. That's all for this video. Thank you for watching, don't forget to like and subscribe, and take care.